Welcome everyone to the UNC Coastal Studies Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the 8th in our series. This is our Underwater Heritage series. This series has been put together with 3 partners: the UNC Coastal Studies Institute, the Graveyard at the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras, and we've been provided support through the Outer Banks Community Foundation, who've provided support to get scholars like Dan Brown back into the state to talk about the work they've been doing. Tonight we're going to, I should say something about Dan. Dan is a graduate of the program in Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. He wrote his thesis on the topic you'll hear about tonight. He graduated in 2013. It feels like 10 years ago, but it was 2013. After he graduated, he went to work as a teaching instructor.
Associate
at the Coastal Carolina University in Myrtle Beach, and he now works for the, what was it again? The
South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology.
South Carolina Institute for Archaeology and Anthropology. I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to hand it across to Dan. The only other thing to mention is we'll keep our questions till the end so that we can have people online listen to the questions that are asked.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for putting this together and for inviting me to talk on a subject that is very dear and near to me. So when I first heard about the Corolla Wreck, it was in the middle of my summer field school out here on the banks. So it's really fun to be back in Manio, to be back out on the banks. It's been a little while. And we heard about this possibly 17th century wreck. It got rolled into part of the summer field school. And I remember at the house we were staying at, someone brought in a copy of the Virginia Pilot, and on the cover was this picture: Ghost Ship, 1609. I'm like, whoa, okay, that's intense. And for a second I'm like, 1609, why do I know 1609? And they were referring to a very famous shipwreck, the Sea Venture. Sea Venture was a ship that departed from England to the very poorly thriving Jamestown colony in 1609. It was the flagship of a flotilla sent with supplies and people to resupply Jamestown. It got caught in a hurricane on the way, suffered for days, and later there were claims that the vessel might have been built too quickly to accommodate so many people and supplies, because after a few days in this storm, it started to take on water, the seams started to open up, and everybody's bailing and everybody's praying. Now, this flagship has the next governor of Jamestown on it. Even he's bailing water, okay? Things are bad. The ship is full of water. That's it. Hope's lost, right? They land on a shoal, come to rest on a shoal just right on Bermuda. Not a soul is lost. Not only that, they're close enough they can walk off the ship onto the island and salvage all the supplies from this ship. Even more than that, within a year, they build 2 more ships and sail on to Jamestown with minus of 2 people accused of thievery. Now, if you know anything about Jamestown, they probably would have been better off staying at Bermuda. But this was not the Sea Venture. Sea Venture was discovered in the 80s and recorded. So a good reference, a good story. Shipwrecks are dramatic, They're romantic, they're tragic, usually a loss of life. Sea Venture was miraculous, so much so that it was the inspiration for Shakespeare's The Tempest, right? So you have a story like that. You got to have survivors, right? You got to have someone of significance that people are worried about, a flagship. What about when you have a ship that has no story, right? So the Corolla Wreck, as it became known, is one of many, right? Out here on the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Called this because there's approximately 5,000 shipwrecks, the earliest known going back to 1526, a Spanish galleon wrecking on the banks. We have data on about 900. That's an approximation. Of these, about 150 are beach wrecks, up and down the coast here. Corolla Wreck washed up here. And washed up, I'm using in loose terms, because even where it came from, literally in the physical sense, in 2008, is still a bit debatable. Did you change the settings? Okay. So 2008, George Brown, who's from New Jersey, He owns a house down in, here in Corolla, or over in Corolla, I should say, up in Corolla. And there's a big storm, a classic September nor'easter. He wakes up the next day, and what does he see in his backyard? A shipwreck. Based on the more than 1,000 photographs that I examined in doing my thesis and trying to figure out this mystery, I approximate that at this time is about 60 feet in length of the bottom of a ship, of a hull of a ship. Now, if you've ever been at the beach and you stand in place in the waves, what happens, right? Your feet get buried. Within a month, the ship is buried, gone, disappears. Brown returns in 2009, December, another big storm, looks outside, and it's back. Same ship remains, but less of it. Okay, it's been reduced to 16 forward timbers. And this time, possibly because it had lost some of its mass, it was no longer approximately 60 feet in length, it became buoyant. Now these remains of a vessel, right, possibly 400 years old, started floating up and down the shoreline, traveling about 9.5 miles over a period of 6 months. Now, it's a testimony to the people that built this ship, okay, that it still stayed intact this many years later, centuries later, in an environment that it wasn't really built for. Okay, it was supposed to be whole. And there it is, January 1st, 2010. Now, this being the Outer Banks, the reason UAB has so many photographs of this is because it's a popular place to visit, right? So people poked at it, prodded at it, were curious, took pictures of it. And there it stayed basically for about a month after washing up and down. And then within a few days, this happens. 2 days later, the wreck is broken up. Something that stayed intact for hundreds of years and a few months washing around suddenly breaks up. This was another part of the puzzle. Where did it come from? How did this happen, right? The best approximation that I can think of is record cold temperatures between late December and early January in 2009, 2010. There's essentially, the wooden fasteners, iron fasteners would have been rusted out, so they wouldn't have been doing anything. And the wooden fasteners essentially gave out. And once you have one major structural element, most likely the keel, right? The keel is often referred to as the backbone of a ship. Once you lose that backbone, the rest is going to start to crumble. So here it is, 2010. Now, let me back up a little bit. When Mr. Brown found this wreck, okay, he reported it to the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources Underwater Archaeology Branch, UAB. They're located down in Fort Fisher, North Carolina. He reported it. He said, there's a shipwreck behind my house. It just so happens that the Corolla Wreck had washed up or become exposed about a mile away from another known wreck, a 19th century schooner called the Ocean Hill Wreck. So when UAB, archaeologists hear, oh, there's a shipwreck near Corolla, a mile away from Ocean Hill, it's probably the Ocean Hill Wreck. So nobody comes out for the first 2 years. Fast forward back today, or to 2010. So finally, enough people have noticed this wreck. They've noticed some features of this wreck. Some local historians are saying this is not a typical wreck. There's not a lot of iron on it. It's almost entirely wooden fasteners. These are big floors. These are big timbers. Somebody needs to take a look at this thing. It's already breaking up. So they plan to come up. By the time they get there, it's already broken up, and which for maritime archaeologists can be both a curse and a blessing. You'd love to see it intact, but individual scantlings or timbers are easier to measure when they're not all cluttered together. So you have essentially the floors here. These would be the ribs, some hull planking, the stem, which is the major structural element of the bow, and the keel. UAB created a photomosaic, a scaled photomosaic, you can see here. Gives the dimensions, Shows this really cool scarf. The scarf is a seam or a joinery. Created a basic site plan, and that was about it. The state doesn't really allocate resources for the recovery of shipwrecks. So to remove this thing took a couple more months. It continued to be a feature story in the Virginia Pilot. I think it was on the news at one point. And basically, a really amazing thing happened. If you know anything about state bureaucracy, it doesn't always run smoothly. We had the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources, the Corolla Fire Department, volunteers from all over the place, Underwater Archaeology branch, all got together, along with a local donations of time from local construction companies, and on April the 6th, decided, let's get it out. Okay, before it washes away, before it breaks up even more, let's salvage this piece of North Carolina history. What's amazing is they did it in one day. Not only did you get all these organizations and volunteers to work together, it happened in a single day. So here you can say they started work very early in the morning, using fire hoses, not the most conventional excavation technique, but to clear sand from the wreck. At this point, actually, it had been buried almost a foot in the sand. And loaded it onto a skid and transported it just near the Currituck Light. And there it sat until August of 2010. So one of the themes that you get from the title, this is a mobile mystery. This is a shipwreck. Other than breaking up and deteriorating into pieces and disintegrating, once a ship wrecks, it usually stays in one place. So now this thing, subject to natural forces, has moved up and down the coast, and now they have cultural forces, people intervening and having an impact on this ship again. If I click, sorry, if I want to do the video, I use the mouse. Oh, or not. So this is just a map showing the different locations over 6 months. Well, I'm sorry, over 2 years. A lot of it in 6 months. There's a march. And then finally, from April 6th from there, up to the lighthouse. So a very unusual shipwreck. Only one I can find in recent memory was the Francis E. Waters, which took out Jeanette's Pier a couple decades ago, and now sits in front of the Nags Head Police Department. So not a very common thing for a vessel to just, hello. So people had also contacted East Carolina's program in maritime studies. And Dr. Nathan Richards, PI, and co-PI Brad Rogers decided to go check it out and decided to include it in a sampling of beach wrecks that we were studying, that we were excavating and recording as part of our field school, along with ocean wrecks and sound wrecks. And at this point, it measured about 17 feet by 30 feet. Now, unfortunately, let me back this up real quickly. You can see how the wreck goes from a pretty good state of preservation here, and look how quickly it begins to dry out. These photos are all taken within one day. Okay. Already the wreck is beginning essentially to desiccate. And here it is by the time we see it in May. Still, I will say, an awesome site. I felt very fortunate to be able to take part in recording these remains. Pretty awesome site when you stand there and just think, wow, somebody worked this piece of wood almost 400 years ago, and it's here. It's a product of a social system, of commerce, of industry. It was very, very exciting. So we set up, first we had to kind of determine, because the bow was gone, which end is which, right? You've got a square section of the bow, but you don't have the bow, you don't have the stern. So we had to change it. Somebody ventured up a tree to try and get a bird's eye view of the curvature of the timbers, as they should narrow towards the stern, or especially towards the bow. And so we decided which end was which. Turns out This side was, the stern. And the other problem posed by this being a mobile wreck is archaeologists study artifacts, right? We study culture, but we also, our evidence is artifacts. And because it was washing up and down the coast, and because people see it and go, whoa, cool, shipwreck, there wasn't a lot of evidence other than the ship itself. This also added to the puzzle. Two artifacts. There was a brass pin stuck in a trunnel hole, a fastener hole, and this concretion with some lead shot. So we set up a baseline, and over a period of 3 days, recorded the remains. There you can see the fool in the tree taking pictures of the remains, and drafted a site plan on site, as well as creating frame profiles. So one of the features that really leapt out at the PIs was this, the same thing that got the attention of local historians. There wasn't a lot of iron on it, okay? Iron, if you don't have to use it, is expensive. It becomes much more available as England begins to industrialize, as Europe begins to industrialize. And certain countries had more access to iron than others. Countries in Northern Europe, Spain, so forth. So what this thing is actually made of and how it's put together reflects where it came from. So these are our first clues. We also did here, which I'll get to, that people had found coins. People had found artifacts. But where were those people, right? We had to make contact. We had to network. We had to meet these people. So when we were very first looking at it, when I was first exposed to this thing, all we had were these features. So some of the features that stood out, these are called trunnels, literally spelled tree nails. Okay, it's a wooden fastener. A hole is drilled, manually, of course, and this is beaten in place to hold frames and framing elements in place. Cheap, labor intensive, but a lot cheaper than iron. And the other reason why some countries didn't use iron is it's going to rust, right? So the less iron in the bottom of the ship, the better. If that rusts out, you're going to be in trouble. So you have trunnels here. This one in particular was interesting. There's the brass pin. My first discovery as an archaeologist. I was very excited. And this chunk of keel. This was lost at one point and washed back up, I think 30 miles south, and somebody contacted UAB. Someone came out and looked at it who said, oh, yeah, I saw that back in April, and it was, or last year, back in January, and it was by the wreck. So this got transported down to the Graveyard Atlantic Museum. We took a trip down there, recorded that as well. And again, some really interesting features that I'll talk more about in a minute. So we went back later that year to try and capture some more information. We decided to try and do a digital recording of the wreck to do a 3D model, right? You can't pick up these timbers and play with them in real life, but if you do a three-dimensional model, you can manipulate it with certain software. The problem was by the time we got back to it, sorry about these dates, this is 2012, it was already beginning to collapse. And I'm not enough of a ship reconstruction person to take warped and desiccated and breaking timbers and turn them back into a shipwreck. If it was in the pristine condition it was in 2010, where you still have the actual curvature of the hull and the dimensions of the strakes and the dimensions of the timbers before they start to shrink and warp, then you can get really good information. So at least we had those drawings. Made some couple cool observations when we went back. We noticed some caulking. So this could be diagnostic, some animal hair and some tar. You could look at the animal hair and try and figure out, okay, what animal was this? Where was this animal from? We noticed some nail holes along the seam of the scarf, of the joint. This would have been left over from a piece of wood that was caulked and just tapped in over the seam. Kind of like you do with installing windows. So here's the site plan. 10 floors or ribs. Yeah, I was right, the aft, yes. Some planks. These are called futtocks or secondary frame elements. And what was also interesting, because if this vessel was from the early half of the 17th century, these shouldn't be there. The way that ships were constructed, we know pretty sure from the archaeological record, before 1650, was you put in these floors and you put in these futtocks and you fasten them from underneath, right? Well, if you want to define the shape of your vessel, later on they started putting in things called tail frames. So towards the bow and towards the stern. Traditionally, you'd have two sets of master frames. You stretch battens, pieces of wood, right? You put up the first few, ribs all the way up. You stretch pieces of wood, nail them in, and then your carpenter knows how to cut the rest of the frames to set them in. Later on, they start getting really good with the math and start pre-assembling more and more frames. We know that from shipwrecks built after 1650. We don't know about anything before then. From what we understand from the literature, this wasn't going on. So it should be a newer ship, maybe. But then there's features that shouldn't show up on a ship built after 1650. So you have this notch cut for the keel that suggests a frame-based construction. Countries that preferred frame-based construction were England, the French, the Spanish, southern Netherlands. We quickly eliminated the Spanish because the Spanish had a very well-founded shipbuilding construction tradition that they didn't really vary from. They also had good access to iron, so they used a lot more of it. And there wasn't a lot of iron on these remains. So that kind of gets rid of the Spanish, despite the fact that some Spanish coins are associated with this ship. And you also have something here that's called a limber hole, right? Who owns a boat, right? You've got to clean the bilge. Well, if your bilge pump stops working, you got trouble. This is essentially the same idea. These holes, which I have a close-up coming later on, these notches here, these little square notches, these allow the water to flow back and forth in the bilge so you don't get wood rot, right? Well, the only culture, the two countries that used the central hole were Spanish and the English. And later on, again after 1650, the English switched to two limber holes, one either side of the keel to allow more flow of water, right? Less rot. So this suggests, again, it's old or Spanish, but it doesn't really look Spanish. So we did these drawings. Here's the keel. And again, after comparing this wreck to 22 other 17th century wrecks, I started to learn a lot more about what these features meant. This is a vertical keel scarf. Generally, the English employed a vertical keel scarf. So all the hints initially are saying, okay, this could be an English ship. So like I said, after the field school, the wreck was moved to the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in August of 2010. It was decided that would be the best place to house it. There were plans to build a structure to protect it from the weather. From what I understand, the only funds were raised enough to build the concrete slab on which it still remains. And the other funds, for some reason, were not acquired. So here's our wreck, still on the move. And what I love, I'm more of a shipwreck guy than an anthropologist, but if you want to get into the anthropology of this wreck, people that wanted to save this shipwreck took it out and put it next to a lighthouse. And then where did it get moved? It got moved to one of the towns of one of the most famous lighthouses in the world, Hatteras. Interesting symbolism. So, factors affecting this. What factors affected the wreck? And like I said before, there were cultural factors, right? It's in the path of a very trafficked area. I'm not saying anybody drove on it. People are avid collectors on the banks. The weather is obviously notorious. And this photograph, remember I was talking about record coal? That's not sand, that's snow. But ultimately, it was the removal of this wreck from its environment that led to its demise. So while I was working on this, we had this question of, all right, this has either got to be a deep water wreck because it's got such good preservation, or this was buried in a really good spot on the banks. The problem is, from my personal experience and that of my advisor, is most of the wrecks that you find on the banks don't last more than a couple hundred years. That's why most of the ones that we know about that are on the beach come from the 19th century. There's also the most phenomenal amount of traffic during that time. So one of the things we look for is something called tornado worm damage. So this is from a piling. And this is a drawing of these ugly little guys. And these guys love wood. They love oak especially. And they are found in the Atlantic. Now, the further north you go, the lower their population is, the shorter their breeding rates are. So it is possible this ship managed to leave during a particularly cold season and wreck in the same season and get buried deep enough where no worm, basically what we call an anaerobic environment, an oxygen-free environment, where no critters are going to get to it, and then stay there offshore for a couple centuries. What could disturb that to make it buoyant, to make it wash ashore? I have no idea. The other possibility is this wreck sank close to shore, washed inshore. I'm sorry, I flipped these around. Sorry, this is the deep water scenario here. So it sinks, is embedded in the substrate, something disturbs it, it comes ashore, and that's how we find it. Or it gets washed ashore, is buried relatively quickly, far enough in the dunes where it doesn't rot. It's the best I could come up with. So in beginning the research for my thesis, I was inspired by J. Richard Steffi, who posited that eventually we'll have enough information on ships, on how they were built, that we won't need the artifacts. I really hope so. And that we'll be able to look at the construction. Once we amass enough information on how different countries, different nations, different cultures built these vessels, we'll be able to look at the vessel and say, aha, that came from here. So that was my primary question, is what is this vessel? What was it used for? What was its function? Where did it come from? To try and answer this, before I was able to get my hands on artifacts, I decided I would look at broad trade patterns, migration statistics, what were people doing? Where were they going? Why were these ships coming to the colonies, to the New World, right? Then examine historic shipbuilding treatises. What did people who designed, sailed on, and in some cases built these ships in the 17th century say about how they were built? Kind of like a Haynes manual of its day. And then compare the Corolla Wreck, the construction features of the Corolla Wreck, to as many contemporary shipwrecks as I could find. I was very fortunate. I started off with 9 and wound up with 22. So finally looking at the construction features and then examining material culture. Perfect. So what are these ships doing, right? This ship is a product of a social system, right? In archaeology, we call this the systemic context. What system is it part of? Well, it's a part of trade. It was a part of migration. You have the prevailing trade winds in black, the warm ocean currents in red, cold ocean currents, and these are pretty consistent. So if you want to leave England or Europe, you're going to sail south, catch here, come over the trade winds, and go to the Caribbean, go up, go wherever it is that you're trying to get to. When you want to go back, catch the Gulf Stream and head on back. It's convenient. And results in the settlement patterns that you see, the trade patterns and so forth. And in doing my historical research, I came across 4 wrecks. Every time I was assigned, I had a paper to write, or I was reading anything, I'd come across, ship disappeared. Went on a list. Try and follow up that ship. Which ship was it? Where did it wreck? What records are there? And usually they knew where it wrecked, or it was, it foundered in New England. Okay, that's probably not it. Or it was this size. Okay, that's not it. So there are 4 possibilities that wrecked kind of in this proximity here. There's the ketch, which actually happened to be the tender to Sea Venture, the boat they used to go between other vessels in the fleet, they had to cut it loose. The Fogelgrip, which I heard from a professor was a Swedish ship, Dutch-built, that disappeared on one of the few Swedish expeditions to Delaware. HMS John, found in a registry of British ships of war lost in the 17th century, wrecked off the Virginia coast. And HMS Swift, wrecked locally and scuttled. So, looking at the social context, one of the things I would suggest is, all right, well, let's just look at population, right? Let's look at the numbers. We know what's being traded, but this is the early 17th century, and I live in the United States, not the UK. So getting access to those kind of records was a little bit limited. And also people weren't keeping the kind of records that you see later in the 17th century and definitely in the 18th century. So limited information. Well, you can see here, in 20 years, the English population in the English colonies more than tenfold, okay, making up 87%. And at the time, in 1630, 83%. France, very little. The French love France so much, I think about 30% of the French that went to Canada went back to France. The Dutch got absorbed ultimately by the English, and as part of their travesty of empire building, New Sweden gave up, was absorbed by the Dutch. Only sent 4 expeditions. So you're just numbers-wise, and again, I'm not looking at Spain because of construction features and so forth, but in North America, where this wreck was found, just population-wise, you have a good chance at it being English. So then after exhausting historical research, I went on looking for historic treatises. And just to make sure, I wanted to read some Spanish treatises and make sure that what they said they built didn't look like the Corolla Wreck. And it was pretty consistent. There's only a few that exist written by the French in the 17th century. It's actually just a series of panels with labels. So that was a good resource. Very visual, shows you what the ship looks like. And this is what I was talking about before. This series of master frames, one towards the stern, one towards the bow, one in the middle. Stretch these battens, measure the curves, and set your frames in. And the Dutch, only 2 treatises were written in the 17th century. And Whitson's was, I think, 1,000 pages long and has only recently been translated. So that was a bit of a puzzle, but fun. And this was written by someone who wrote about northern Amsterdam ship construction, and Van Eyck wrote about Rotterdam, southern Amsterdam. Southern Netherlands. And you think a country that small would have a pretty consistent shipbuilding ship construction tradition. But you could go to Rotterdam, and a Dutch foot in Rotterdam was 13 inches, and a Dutch foot in Amsterdam was something different. Okay, so you got quite a bit of variation. The Dutch preferred assembling the hull first and then putting in the frames. So you got a really flat curvature. The Southern Dutch, like the English, built the frame first, so you get a nice wine glass curve here. Problem is you have 17 feet of frame. Could it be Southern Dutch? Is it the flat of the hull, of the bow? And thankfully, the English were really getting into ship construction and decided to write about it. So you have several treatises that discuss how you build a ship over a span of time in the 17th century. This is an image taken from Matthew Baker's Fragments of English Shipwrightry. Beautiful book. And that would be a typical late 16th century English galleon. So looking at all these things, looking at the terms that the countries used, one of the most fascinating things I found is I don't have access to all of these wrecks, right? I can look at the statistics and I can look at the evidence. But even just looking at the language of how the Dutch referred to a frame or how the French referred to a frame, I had this moment when I was translating Whitson, and I knew by the location he was talking about of this framing element that he was talking about a rider, a sort of secondary frame you lay in on top of the first frame. And thinking with my English language brain, I'm thinking, that can't be a rider. I'm sorry, that can't be a rib. A rib is the bottom. That's the floor, which is why in English we call it the floor. It's on the bottom. And finally, I read it and read it and read it. He's talking about a rider. Oh, the Dutch don't care where it is. The Dutch care about the function. It's forming the ribs, so it's a rib. Whereas the English brain thinks, where is it? Location, it's the floor. The French are more concerned, again, with function. It's strengthening the whole. So the French call it a knee, which in English is a totally different part. But it comes from the French word for the bottom of the fort, the point where the fort meets the ground, which is the strongest point. So that was just fascinating culturally to wrap my head around the different ways that countries looked at and thought about how they built ships. So then came the fun part, cataloging, finding resources, and cataloging 22 historic European shipwrecks and looking for trends in their construction features, their fastening patterns, construction order. Was it frame-based? Was it bottom-based? All these different things. And I will say, I was fortunate enough to actually visit Vasa a few times, and there was no better classroom than being inside a existing 17th century warship. Pretty amazing. So I looked at all of these. Be a useful chapter for anyone that wants to follow up. And then what else? What else can we look at? What else can we examine from the Corolla Wreck, right? And this is one of those ironic things that makes its current state so tragic, is that the wood is so far gone, the most, when it was sampled in 2010, they could get out of what is that it was a type of oak referred to as sessile or Durmast oak. All right? A plank was sampled, a frame was sampled, a trundle was sampled, a fastener, a species of white oak. So I looked up, all right, where is Quercus petraea found? And unfortunately, not enough information was left in those samples to extract anything more specific than, all right, this is a white oak that grows in Europe, so we at least know it wasn't built from American oak. So finally, in 2012, two residents on the Outer Banks, Roger Harris and Ray Midget, were generous enough to allow myself and some classmates to come out and look at their collections from the Corolla Wreck and photograph them, and were very enthusiastic in helping us catalog these. So we created an artifact catalog, photographed everything to scale, and I'll talk about some of the other ones, but the first two that really stuck out were these French coins. Because the wreck moved locations, right? So it was very hard to corroborate what we call the provenience, the archaeological context. Where was this object when it was found? If no one took a picture of it in its context, then I can't confirm, what location was this? Where was this? Was it from this wreck? So after sifting through, I think it was about 1,200 photographs and identifying who took them in what chronological order, I finally started to see, okay, the actual story, the actual changing of the wreck, the locations it was in. And in one of these photographs, I noticed this lump on this plank. And I have another photograph of this plank from when the ship broke up in January 2010. It was later picked up, and a concretion was removed, which you can see here, containing two French coins, two specific French coins, Louis XIII double tournois, only minted 1610 to 1643. Here's the closest thing to a smoking gun for certain reasons. So here's the coin, pretty good state of preservation. Other things we looked at included brass pins, lead shot, there's a gun lock, a pair of dividers, all in pretty great condition. The problem is, the most common artifact in the collection was brass pins and lead shot. Now, lead shot you can learn something from, but at the time I didn't have the resources or the time to have them analyzed in England to figure out where this lead was, where this lead was made. Is it English? And the problem with brass pins is they're pretty much made the same way for 400 years. Americans tried to start making their own, but it was too much of a challenge, so we imported brass pins until the 19th century, well into the 19th century. So their chemical makeup is very hard to distinguish from different countries. But this is some cool stuff. Rigging elements. Rigging elements are a jackpot, okay? Rigging elements generally fall away from the ship when the ship sinks. They're not usually heavy enough to get buried, so they get eaten up by worms, they disintegrate, they're gone. So to find them on any wreck is very fortunate. This, when I talked to a professor, former professor who works at the Vasa Museum, I showed him this picture. He said, wow, that looks like a Vasa deadeye. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, go look. So I will do some research, and oh yeah, look, in Anderson's Rigging of 17th Century Ships, he has this flat-faced deadeye. Called this because if you flip it over, it looks like a skull. And I was like, well, that's pretty cool. And he goes, well, those were only really existed between 1610 and 1640. So that, again, narrows our window down. One of the coolest things in the collection was this bag of hail shot. This is a bag that would have been tarred, essentially very similar to grape shot, but older, and included something called iron dice. Shows up in the historical record in 1520 on the Henry Grace Adu, iron dice for hail shot, and the iron dice is for added anti-personnel effect, dense hard lump of cube of iron. So, okay, there's Spanish coins, there's French coins, there's English coins. Which one is it, right? Is this an English ship, a Spanish ship, a French ship? No Dutch coins. Well, a mixed assemblage of coins turned out not to really be a problem, because in the 17th century, hard currency was hard to come by. The most common complaint in the colonies later on was the lack of cash. Also, sailors are mobile by nature, so merchants and sailors are going to use whatever currency they can get their hands on. So that doesn't actually cause too much of a problem. And some of them date quite well. Hold on a second. So there's Spanish Maravedis, which I haven't had dated. I don't know if Ray, you've gotten them dated since. And then some English artifacts. A copper alloy finial, looks like a certain regent. A penny weight, these were only made from 1602 onward. They changed the weight of a penny in 1602. And a English coin during the reign of Charles I, 6 years before he was executed, from 1643. So again, we're focusing in on a certain time period here. So you have the French coins, roughly 1610 to 1640s, French lead bailing seals and coins. So all right, we've got treatises suggesting this part of the century. We've got material culture from a little before the first half of the century. Let's look at these features. Let's look really closely at this wreck. Look at these construction features. What do they suggest? Well, aside from the trunnels being the predominant fastener, we noticed these square pegs. And initially it was thought, wait, the English didn't use square pegs, they used wedges. They used rectangular wedges. Well, they're here, they're here, they're here, they're here. They're on the outside of the apron. So initially it was like, well, then maybe it is Dutch. Well, after doing more digging and research, turns out the English did, at some point, start using square wedges. The question was when. And we know the Dutch definitely like to use it, right? We also know, though, that there were American 19th century wrecks that had square wedges. So again, this is not a smoking gun. Vasa, square wedges, 17th century, Dutch built, for the Swedish Navy, but Dutch built. Dutch wrecks from the Christian shaven wrecks, square peg, square peg, square peg, square peg. And Fort Story wreck, an 18th century wreck that washed up in Virginia. It's like, all right, well, what else is diagnostic? What else is consistent in looking at all of these wrecks? What is a common pattern among these wrecks? And this one was actually a nice revelation. Every wreck, every English wreck that I looked at that 17th century employed a vertical keel scarf, a vertical joint. And this is a very particular type of joint. This is called coped and nibbed. It's a table scarf where the receiving one is cut out for its partner, right? This is a digital reconstruction, the notch exaggerated so you can see the depth. The Dutch preferred, both in the north and the south, horizontal keel scarves. Whitson was talking about northern ship construction, horizontal keel scarf. Some other examples of vertical keel scarves. Sea Venture, see that shape? Wrecked 1609, Dartmouth, wrecked 16, I want to say 98, 78, somewhere in there. And remember the nail hole I mentioned would have been found somewhere in here. So then it comes back, all right, well, what about that limber hole? Spanish or English? And in my research and reading Whitson, I learned that the Dutch, being very efficient culturally, like I said, they don't really care what the location of that timber is. They're going to name it based on what it's doing. So in the Dutch, this is referred to as a tingle. Has no translation that I could find. The English call it a fillet or a filler. So the Corolla has a notch cut out for the keel and a central limber hole. This is my crude reconstruction. This is what it should look like, that dark space as a gap. And this, by the way, is the false keel that this part is cut out for. A false keel is also called a sacrificial keel. So if the ship grounds, you don't lose the whole keel, and it can be easily replaced. Well, the Dutch, why go to the work of cutting out all that wood, which is going to weaken this timber, right? And that little notch there to make this all fit nicely together when you can just take your garbage strake, stretch it down, lower it, and create a natural gap for water and air to flow back and forth. Very practical. Cheaper, too. So remember those ships I talked about. Oh. Turns out the Ketch was only a 40-foot long boat, 40 feet overall. Focal Grip, turns out, did not wreck in Delaware. It wrecked in the Baltic on its way back from Delaware. So that's not going to be here. Also, I mean, could be within the range of the weight, of the length and tonnage, but not sure. John, turns out John was a fourth rate. Well, HMS John had been a merchant ship. It was part of a fleet that was dispatched to Virginia to bring the colonies in line during parliamentarian rule. So they weren't, behaving. It wrecked on its way there, off of Virginia. That's the best location we have. And then HMS Swift is too small. 76 feet overall, 154 tons, not big enough for the timbers that you see on the Corolla Wreck. So that makes John the best potential candidate from the historical record. So we have the possibility of John based on occurrence and site, right? Population points to most likely England. If you look at construction features, central limber hole, vertical tabled keel scarf, heavier squared frames. I didn't talk too much about that, but the English, again, are kind of particular. The Dutch are efficient. The English, they want those frames, almost every one of them, square by a foot, 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters on average. The Dutch, their width and thickness vary. They also use more of them because they're not as big, and they're not as concerned as to how many they are exactly. So you have a pattern. Thijs Marveld cataloged all 17th century Dutch and English ships and look at their frame ratio, frame to length ratio, right? It's a brilliant idea. All right, is there a pattern here? Not just in how they're built, but how many they use over the length of the keel. And it turns out the average English is 13 frames per 4 meters. The Dutch use 18 to 20 frames per 4 meters. Corolla falls right there. Learned that at a conference and got very excited. Dutch features. A broad keelson. This is the timber that sits on top of the keel once the frames are laid in. The English generally would use a very large, heavy one. The Dutch would use a wider keel, not as great a molded dimension. Very bluff, flat floors with little compassing or curvature at the bow. As you can see, that back there, it looks pretty square. There's some curvature, but it just starts to happen. So what about Southern Dutch? Dominant use of trunnels over iron fasteners, oblique trunnels, trunnels through plank seams. Did I miss that slide? Oh, I lost the slide, sorry. Essentially, this all suggests that English or Southern Dutch. There's various reasons why you would double your trunnels. You'd run them obliquely, and all this does is it tightens the hull. It tightens the frames, the planks together, creating a stronger hull for the ship. Equally thick ceiling and hull planking. Luting is a type of caulking that use cow hair, I think, to create a seal. So what happens is with all this force, right, both the Southern Dutch and English, they're trying to take this structure that's going to be under immense tension, but it also has to give, right? So it's got to work like a spring. So wood is going to give a little better than iron. By increasing the number of trunnels in different directions, you're varying the grain of that wood, and the grain is where the strength is. And by putting equally thick ceiling and hull planking, you're creating a sandwich of tension to hold this whole structure together so it can go out on the ocean and do its thing. All right. Future research, I don't think it's been completely exhausted. I think there's still some potential there to learn more from this wreck, even as it continues to degrade. Looking at the site management would be a good one. Cultural perceptions and shareholders, how different people, different shareholders, people interested in this wreck viewed it as a cultural resource, as a scientific resource. There are organics that have survived from this wreck. Those could be analyzed. There are labs that specialize in that. Further artifact analysis, looking at concretions, having them x-rayed, having some of those artifacts conserved. Digital reconstruction, I did some very rudimentary three-dimensional reconstruction based on the drawings that we did in 2010. And then one thing I've been interested in is creating a map, potentially online, interactive, with a chronology of the wreck locations and structures. So photographs, a map that you could interact with. You can click on this wreck, this location, this date, and see what it looked like then. Kind of ongoing, working on it. So just to recap, here it is, September 2008, December 2009, January 2010, June 2010, and October 2010. This is the last photo I have of it. I haven't been there since 2012, and that very first frame had finally collapsed and given in. That got repeated. So looking at the material culture, concentration of 17th century artifacts, mixed nationalities, again, not so much of a problem because this was a culture, the Atlantic world was heavily engaged in trade. Terminus post quem of 1643 means this wreck could not have wrecked before 1643 with that Louis XIII Tournois, or 1640. So again, these possible candidates, I think John fits the best. I'm sorry, I think I lost a slide somewhere. So in summing up, this wreck, its significance is in its place in history, right? Archaeologists study material things to better understand the past. And so what was fascinating is by not knowing the identity of this wreck, by not knowing where this wreck was going, who was on it, or what happened to it, we were able to learn so much more about how these ships were built and even perceptions of what they meant and what different parts of the ship meant to different countries that built them. The mystery is not entirely solved, but as I said, for a historic candidate, I think HMS John's probably the best bet. Archival research in England, because an English ship goes missing in 1652, somebody's going to have a record of it, okay, especially if it's from the Royal Navy. And the other reason I skipped over this is it was really small for a fourth rate. Okay, 367 tons is small, and it's because it had been a merchant ship, was bought by the Navy, and converted into a 28-gun fourth rate. That's small, even for 1652. That fits around the size of these scantlings. So my best bet, probably English, could have been Southern Dutch, but I think this is a 17th century English shipwreck, probably hailing from the 1640s or a little bit later. Could have been built earlier, but definitely wrecked sometime in the 1640s. Thank you.